This is actually our kickoff event for day 2. Just briefly before we begin and before I introduce Rebecca, I just wanted to kind of go over some of the events that will be taking place after this one. So at 2 o'clock, Barbara Drucker will be here and we'll be screening her film Bread and Death. And Patrick Polk from the Department of World Arts and Cultures will be joining us to have a brief discussion. That's about a 25-minute film with about a 20-minute discussion after that. And then at 4 o'clock, at CNSI, which is California Nanosystems Institute, which is located in South Campus in the Science Court, Philip Beasley, who's one of the featured artists, will be giving a presentation in the auditorium there. It's actually going to be very interesting. Some of us were there. Quite a few have been working on the installation for a few days now, so that'll be an interesting presentation. And depending on where they are in the stages of completing it, we may be able to go upstairs and tour it. After that, after Philip Beasley's presentation, we're all just going to walk over to the Biomed Library, which is about a 5-minute walk from CNSI. And on the 4th floor, the Louise Darling Biomed Library, there is the Special Collections. It's a very special kind of research arm for the Science Library, and in the vaults they have very beautiful and very precious rare books. A lot of them are art books from as early as the 13th century. They have very beautiful old Persian texts, and the curator there, Cherry Williams, is going to be bringing out a lot of these onto tables, and she's going to give a talk about the body as it's rendered through text and time. And as well in that, you'll also learn a lot of interesting techniques that were employed in the 15th, 16th century for doing these really beautiful body anatomical maps. They're really, really beautiful books. I've seen a lot of them already, so strongly encourage that. And then after that ends, we'll be going over to the Matthias Botanical Gardens, which is right across the street down the hill, 2 minutes. And A.J. Wilcox from Australia is going to be screening a short film in the Nest, which is a small little amphitheater in the gardens, very dark. Very short film, it's like 4 minutes, and then we'll have a little short discussion by moonlight, and that will conclude day 2. And then tomorrow is day 3. There'll be Belinda Starkey will be kicking it off with cinematic explorations of death, decay, and transformation. And then after that will be Rosalind Fisher, and then Sylvia Ragone will give a small presentation. And then we'll go upstairs and have a kind of closing reception for Philip Beasley's work. And also for Sylvia Ragone's work, Neoplastic Knitting, which is being shown next door to the installation where Philip Beasley is being installed. And that's on the 5th floor of CNSI. And as well, we also have an exhibition here, actually right behind you in the Vermont Gallery. And this is Rebecca Mendez's work, who I'll be introducing right after this. Gestation. It's really beautiful prints. And as well, Sylvia has one small piece in there as well. So that'll be on display till, I believe it's the end. I'm not sure what's in the next thing will be coming up in there, but it'll be on till Wednesday. Yeah, so please, after this or any time in between, feel free to browse around the space. Great, so it's really an absolute pleasure. Hi, Susan. Can she hear me? It's really a great pleasure to be able to introduce this next event. And especially I'm not going to be introducing Susan per se, but it's really been lovely that Susan's been so gracious to work with us. She was actually going to be here in person, but because of some circumstances, she needed to stay home. And so because of that, Rebecca Mendez, who's going to introduce her and lead a discussion, came up with a brilliant idea of let's do this via web feed. And it was really smart considering Susan's work and so forth. So I think this is actually just going to be a fabulous conversation. So I actually really want to thank Rebecca very much for being so willing to step up and really help make this happen. So to introduce Rebecca, Rebecca's a graphic artist, designer. She's an activist. She's a critical thinker. She's not only been involved in academia, but previously to this, she was also very much working in the commercial sector and industry design. So I think that's really wonderful because she brings forth two very important perspectives on this kind of work. The ability to not only practice it, but also to talk about it. Just to name a few of her credits, her work's been presented in public and in private collections, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the National Design Museum in New York, the Denver Art Museum, the Musée José Luis Cuervas in Mexico City. And recently, her work has been exhibited at the Pompidou Center in Paris as part of the exhibition Morphosis, Continuities of the Incomplete, which sounds fabulous. Her research and practices are transmedial and interdisciplinary. She's an artist, and through her photography, videography, and installations, she explores the dialogue between the weather and the landscape as a way to address issues of time and space in relation to human physicality. So it's really a very wonderful accompaniment to Susan's work as well, I think, between the two of them. She considers, she journeys quite a lot to Iceland regularly, and because of that, she gets to really explore this relationship between geography and the corporeality, I think, as I could say. She's collaborated with tons of wonderful people, and just to name a few would be Frank Gehry, Tom Main, architects Greg Lynn and Enrique Norton, artist Bill Viola, Robert Ores Torres, film director Mike Figgis, Renee Dalder, and writer Adam Yunes. And please help me give a really warm welcome to Rebecca Mendez. Thank you.
That was a very nice introduction for me to now introduce Susan. So that's very, thank you. Okay, so I'll start. I love this one remark Brian Eno made about our digital technology, which is the problem about computers is that there is not enough Africa in them. He continued with, what pisses me off is that it uses so little of my body. In 2007, I spent the year designing a book for MIT Press called Closer, Performance, Technologies, Phenomenology by Susan Kozel. In this 360-page book, Susan explores the notion that as our computers become closer to our bodies, perspectives from phenomenology and dance can help us understand the wider social issues of digital technologies and to design future technologies that expand our social, physical, and emotional exchanges. Susan Kozel is a performer, choreographer, and writer based in Boston and London. Through her work, she researches the physical and philosophical vocabularies emerging from the convergence of dance and media technologies. Susan has a PhD in philosophy from the University of Essex, UK, and her writings about the physical experience of digital technologies to create new philosophical paradigms have been widely published. In addition, Susan has been trained in movement practices such as yoga, Pilates, and improvisational, and in dance forms such as Butoh, modern dance, and classical ballet. Susan is principal researcher at the Smart Lab, University of East London, and the founder of MESH Performance Partnership. All of the MESH projects have a profound phenomenological approach. Phenomenology calls for a return to lived experience as a basis for understanding and return to body knowledge and perception. It is a shift from asking, what is the world, to how do I experience the world? In Closer, Susan writes, the creation of performance and installation at the interface between bodies and technologies calls for a strong methodological inquiry based on what our bodies are actually experiencing while they are in the responsive computer systems we have built. Our experiences are outrunning the methodologies available for making sense of them and for critiquing them. As we engage bodily with our technologies, we reflect upon our experiences and derive structures of meaning, embodied meaning. Phenomenology as a methodology is becoming increasingly important as we transform our bodies, our technologies, and our environment. Susan recently became mother of Orla. And her baby girl is having her first bout of a bad cold, which made it impossible for Susan to fly here. It is, however, strangely appropriate that we would meet via this web video feed, and I trust that Susan's intelligence, grace, and passion will travel the distance and bring us closer. It is with great honor I introduce Susan Kozel.
Thank you, Rebecca, for that lovely introduction. Is my audio coming through?
Yes, very clear.
Yeah? Okay, just had to check that. As Rebecca mentioned, I'm not able to be with you today for a most corporeal of reasons, which is the illness of a baby who, until recently, was part of my own body. And now she's at once separate, but still very much connected. So I'm trying to navigate that whole question of self and other, and how she's different, but not entirely different. I'm beginning this way because what I'll talk about will touch a little bit on ideas of difference and otherness and strangeness. But first I will say that it's great to be able to be here via Skype, because I was afraid I was just going to have to miss the entire event. Although hearing what you've got planned for the rest of today and tomorrow makes me really wish I was there in person too. But thank you, Stephanie and Rebecca and Gareth, for helping set up the Skype connection. When I plan to be with you actually fully in the flesh rather than mediated flesh, I was going to work with some kinesthetic experiments and have you moving in the space physically. So that won't work, although I have used web feeds to do physical workshops in the past, improvisation workshops. What I'm counting on for the kinesthetic component are visuals and a discussion with Rebecca, but also with any of you in the audience who may want to dive in and say something, because we know that visuals and concepts and memories and thoughts and imagination are all highly kinesthetic too. I'll also read a little bit from various sections of my book, which Rebecca did an extraordinary job designing. If she has any copies there, I would encourage you to have a look at them, because it's wonderful what she was able to do. So I'll also talk about a couple of projects, 2 past ones and one that's in process. I'm curious, how many people are there in the audience?
How many?
Yeah. It's always nice to have a sense of who's sitting there.
There's about 12, number 14 people, 15?
Okay. So it's a nice small seminar group then. That's good.
Yes. And of course, you're being streamed to a lot of people too. So you're being
through the web, of course, our web people. So let's start this title, Effervescence and Fatigue. Let me get up to that on my own copy. That's a quote from Merleau-Ponty. So if we move to the first slide.
And move you around.
And move me around at will, please. I am close enough to the other who speaks to hear his breath and feel his effervescence and fatigue. The rest of that quote reads, what additional responsibilities arise once we are that close to somebody, once we recognize that we're actually sharing breath and sharing physical intersubjectivity with people at all times. And when we ask about responsibilities, we're also asking about ethics. So ethics are never very far away. Given the topic of this seminar, Body, Art and Disease, I wondered why it was the weak, sick or vulnerable body that makes us feel the weight of ethics most strongly, when ethics also applies to vitality and vigor, to all shapes of materiality and all sensory engagement with the world and with others. So let's move to the next slide. And this is from Jean-Luc Nancy, his wonderful book called Corpus. A body's material, it's dense, it's impenetrable. Penetrate it and you break it, puncture it, tear it. I was asked to talk about wearable technologies in particular. I worked for quite a number of years on the Whispers Wearable project. And the thing about wearable computing, when it's embedded in garments and worn close to the skin, is that they really draw us into proximity, not just with ourselves, but with other people. So when I proposed an abstract for this talk, I identified the play between the real internality of affective states and the externality of social choreographies as being a topic to consider. I also mentioned that Deleuze's reading of meat in the paintings of Francis Bacon would be brought to bear on the garments of Whisper, which is the wearable computing project. But as I reflected on Bacon and meat, and even was able to go to a major exhibition in London 2 weeks ago of Francis Bacon's work, I found myself starting from a performance project rather than just the wearables project. And this project's called Imminence. Let's have the next slide. I will talk about Imminence in a moment. Oops. It's, is that the one, or is it? I think you skipped one.
How about
Yes,
this one, the
that's
body's
it.
material? Mhm.
That's it, yeah. So a body's material, it's off to one side, distinct from other bodies. A body begins against another body. And the void is itself a subtle kind of body. The book that I mentioned is called Closer. And this refers to more than just the convergence of bodies with technologies, but also a sense of proximity. And with this proximity, there's this awareness that we can never actually swallow up the other or the technologies. We can get as close as we possibly can, but there's always, I've come to realize, a sort of difference at the heart of this. So even though you can actually feel like you're incredibly close or almost inside another person through technologies or through emotional closeness or through whatever it is that draws us to people, there's always this sense of almost like a dropout or a lag where suddenly we're confronted with the fact that the other person is different, but also that we are different from ourselves. And this difference, I want to suggest, or otherness, makes up an ethics that is also at the heart of performing with digital data. And it's not just me who's dreamt this up. There's a very strong tradition of looking at an ethics of otherness coming from the continental philosophical tradition. And Emmanuel Levinas is one of the main people who comes to mind with his work on alterity. The reason I'm saying this as part of an extended intro is that the third project that I want to talk about, if we have time at the end, is a new initiative called Designing Difference. And it starts from a philosophical and a physical standpoint and tries to look at an ethics of new design. Okay, so let's have a next slide. So here we go, the three projects. Oh, we keep going back to the title page, don't we?
No, I think that's what happens when I move you around. It jumps back to that one.
Oh, okay.
That's going to happen.
That's all right.
Yeah.
Sure. So we can have the next slide again.
That one of your text? Uh-huh.
Yeah. It's just from some devising. I find the devising for thought is very similar to the devising for performance work. I'd like to introduce different modes. And then we'll have another slide. Imminence with the credits for the extraordinary artists I work with. I must say that all of the projects I do, and no less the book, they're extraordinary collaborations. So I always like to credit the people I work with who've got this incredible interdisciplinary set of skills and an awful lot of heart and patience and humor. So Imminence, from the next slide, is in the context of this conference. I'd like to look at it in terms of decay, meat, and motion. This idea of meat is not one that I would have normally brought to bear on the work when I was just looking at Merleau-Ponty, but it's one that comes through Deleuze, and it comes through really considering not just the sort of beautiful and lyrical and fluid sides of the body, but when the body falters, when the body decays, when the body experiences pain or injury. And the Deleuze's writing on Bacon really brings that to bear really beautifully. So let's have the next slide. This reference here to the instant falling out of phase with itself refers not just to the temporal flow, but to difference and identity. I'm going to read a little bit from the book here. As Levinas says, the instant falls out of phase, but I too fall out of phase with myself. The reversibility of this movement was never a self-identical mapping, never exactly in sync or coinciding with expectations. Of course, I developed an implicit narrative throughout the devising process for Imminence, for which I should say I was the concept developer and choreographer, and then at the last minute I had to step in as one of the dancers too. Once in the system, which was really a series of systems, we had a motion capture system, we had a system that showed medical visualizations of brain and heart, and we had quite a simple camera feedback system that I ended up working in, where the visual image of the body was taken through Isadora, which is an extraordinarily rich piece of software by Mark Coniglio. Many of you who work with live performance may know this. So the question was, how does one work in camera feedback software, which is actually not a very sophisticated system whatsoever, given the work that's been done over the past 20 years. And I felt, reading again, I had to let the movement occur through listening, feeling, and receiving prior to acting or at the same time as acting. And here's a wonderful quote from Levinas, who absolutely did not write about dance and did not write about technologies. He says, movements of hands and fingers that explore, of a head that changes points of view, and of hearing, movements of contraction and decontraction of the eye muscles. These muscular acts and these perceptive acts are mixed, tied to the exploratory activity of a skin that touches. The imminence in this performance was virtual in as much it was both deeply internal, but at the same time about to occur, which people like Brian Masumi would say is the essence of the virtual, which is that which has not quite happened yet. So let's move to the next slide. Oh, I think we skipped one. There should be the two stills prior to the video. It's the one of...
I think this one started the two.
Oh, this is it. Yes, that's right. Sorry, I'm looking at the screen on an angle.
Yeah.
Maybe if I do this, it'll help. This talk gave me a chance to do something I don't always have a chance to do, which is to actually look at rehearsal footage. So if there are dancers in the audience, you'll know, or any designer or creator, how important process is and how often we get caught up in the product and the documentations of the product. So I got a chance to go back to some of the visual experimentations we did with the Isadora patches in the studio. And the one on the left is a still from a patch. And the image on the right is a very early Bacon painting. Halfway through the devising process for this, I suddenly realized that I felt like I was living and moving and breathing inside a Bacon painting. And this was a real turning point for me, because when you try not to have too many preconceptions in a performance piece with technologies, which is a phenomenological move, attempt to bracket out biases, when you try not to have the preconceptions, you're actually building your sense of what's happening while you're doing it. And you have these pivot points, these turning points. So for me, having a sense of being in a Bacon painting made all the sense for the movement for me. It was basically where the improvisation came from for the performance. And as I looked back on some of Bacon's work, I discovered some extraordinary visual and visceral resonances. I almost felt a bit, presumptuous putting Bacon up with some of our stills, because I have so much respect for him. But I'm also fascinated enough to hope that you're interested in the juxtapositions too. So let's have the next slide with some rehearsal footage, a little video here. And while it's going, I'll read out a bit and then open so Rebecca can say something. So here's a bit from the book which deals explicitly with the feeling of performing. A peculiar relation with alterity occurred in one particular section of Imminence, as my body became flesh or meat. My movement was transfigured into visuals, with the uncanny look and feel of a live Francis Bacon painting. My face and limbs seemed to be stripped of the outer layer of skin, appearing like raw meat, with moments where eye sockets, ribs, teeth, or fingers were clearly visible prior to dissolving anew into a visceral smearing. There was a feeling of having been flayed, but also a tremendous life force or power to this state of a body turned inside out. Levinas's description of the encounter with the face of the other was challenged. Denuding itself of its skin, this is Levinas, sensibility on the surface of the skin, at the edge of the nerves, offering itself even in suffering. But the face-to-face relation between myself and the image was not distant and respectable. The other was grotesque, distorted flesh, and I echoed this, feeling my own self transformed into moving meat. Writing on Bacon, Deleuze identified in the paintings what I felt in my body, an intense movement flowing through my body and that of the digital other, a deformed and deforming movement. So what I will say is that the clip that I've shown you doesn't fully give a sense of the meat quality that appeared. So maybe the next one can also do it. The Isadora was a very fine system to work with, and the most subtle lighting conditions made a difference. Here we've got two more stills where the accidental streaking of the background was another incredible echo that just happened without us intending to reproduce Bacon at all. So if we move to the next video, there really was this ability to move your body slowly enough and to get the sense of the bones of the teeth showing, or the fingers, or even the ribs. So the movement dialogue, the movement improvisation was all about trying to, through the technology, peel away the layers of my body. I realize I'm talking a lot, Rebecca. I don't know if there's...
No, but it's really nice. No, it's
Yeah?
yeah.
Okay. And I can read another section here, because Levinas places a lot of emphasis in his ethics of otherness on the face-to-face of myself and the other. And here I'm reading again. There were no faces in any of the visuals in Imminence, but there were insinuations of faces. There was meat in the purples, reds, and oranges. There were zones of indiscernibility, or undecidability between man and animal, between self and other, between human and non-human. Despite knowing that my movement contributed to and provided the movement narrative for the raw visual effects in Imminence, they were the impetus for my emotional and physical shifts through the space. I was compelled to respond. I didn't direct. I felt I was constantly in a listening, responsive position. If I stopped responding, I felt as if I was evicted from the intimate flow into a position of outsider on my own actions.
Very nice. You know, it reminds me some of the things that you were mentioning, and I'm just going to interject, but there was, Deleuze spoke so beautifully about Actually, no, this was Francis Bacon, when in a dialogue with Deleuze about saying that he, you know, how so many people think that Francis Bacon is, you know, pessimist, and the way that he's dealing with his is very dark and very crude. But he said, he's like, I might be cerebrally pessimist, but I am nervously an optimist. And I think that has a lot to do with this kind of, you know, just dealing with the nerve endings and bypassing logic in a way for some of the work.
Yeah, the nervous system, yeah. Let's move to the next one, because there's another video that we can talk through.
Do you want me to
actually, here's the quote. There's the nervous system quote. Interestingly, bringing that up again.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the two videos that you just saw were from rehearsals, and this image is a still from the performance. So when you're staging something, you're obviously dealing with a juxtaposition of the digital and the physical. And there's a question of how do you let there be a balance between the physical body and the digital image without having the privilege lent to one or the other. And different actors, directors, choreographers will try different strategies for this. But I've always preferred having the projection surface right next to me and having the image the same size as me. So not smaller, but also not overtly gargantuan. So let's move to the next one, and there's another piece of footage here. This is actually from rehearsal again, but it gives you a sense. It's the upper left. It looks like a still, but it's actually a video. Yeah, that one. If you start that one.
The video?
Yeah.
I think the video of that one, I wonder if it's somewhere else. It was not...
Okay. Oh, well, okay. So what this just shows is a different series of the visual qualities that Jamie Griffiths was able to get, and an uncanny sense of this figure in the bottom right walking through a screen. Oh, is that working?
Yeah, it's moving now.
Oh, fantastic. That's good. The audience was standing just on the other side of the screen and literally within 6 feet of my performing body and the other two women who were in this piece. It was very important to create a very strong proximity between a very limited number of audience members and the performers. This is a little representation of some of the tensile quality that the Bacon-ish images invited. Okay, let's see if So let's move on to whispers now, for a different sense of meat and a different calling forth of Deleuze on Bacon. So once again, we've got an incredibly talented team. Tekla Shiphorst was, she and I co-directed this project for the early years, and then in the end, she took over most of the direction, and I pulled back a little bit just with being, overloaded doing other things. But Whisper was very much a project that came from our desires to get a sensibility, a deeply corporeal sensibility to inform not just the creation of wearable devices, but the whole process of working with software and hardware engineers. So if we move to the next screen, our trio of entangled words here: abject, affect, and flesh. So much has been written about the Whisper project. This is a huge project. I'm going to just give a cursory glance in on it, and if any of you want to pursue it, there's a website, but also there's the chapter in the book, and Tekla's written about this too. So if you're really particularly interested in this project, I'm more than happy to point you to some very rich writing on and around it. When a project lasts for 6 years, it can't help but create a myriad of bodies associated with it. So with the next screen up, lately I've been interested, because of this play between internality and externality, and how the body is porous to others and porous to the environment. I've looked at some older representations. There's a beautiful one by Schlemmer, which I'm sure many of you have seen, the body literally radiating outwards into space. And the next one, echoing this, an incredible image from a massage therapy text called Anatomy Trains. This is literally human connective tissue, which is so amazingly visceral. It takes on an internal level what we just saw on an outward level. And then the next one, our friend Laban looking at human kinesthetic fields. 1930s, German Expressionism, and then moving to another one, the next image. This is a very early diagram representing the Whisper project and how we thought we would have an array of people in space, each emanating whatever it is they choose to emanate, but also the devices. So we wanted to give an equal respect to these devices that we would create, these alternate bodies in space that would also have their own emanations. At this time of devising this piece, Tekla and I were fascinated by human electromagnetic fields. And we even went on a training course in a sort of hands-on therapeutic technique called electromagnetic field balancing, where we literally trained our palms to be able to sense human electromagnetic fields and went through a series of literally certification techniques in this practice. Tekla also went on to study kinesiology. We used muscle testing and kinesiological practices in the devising of the garments, which I'll get onto. We built garments in this project. I'll pause for one moment on the garments to show one more slide. Working with Christina Andersen, she's a Danish designer who's got a beautiful play with very simple diagrams. She's taught me a lot about the design process and a very simple but powerful way of representing anything. So these mutations are how we thought we would see people connecting with either themselves or with other people through our Whisper garments. So we've got an array of relationships here that range from sensing between, to touch, to mutation, to stretching, to expansion, to convergence. We worked across language and we worked across the many ways that people communicate, either across distance through technologies or intimately with technologies or intimately without technologies. We'll have one more slide. Another beautiful image of bacon, which I couldn't help but think was one of our little mutation slides. So let's move on to the next slide, and I'll explain what this project is about. Some of you may have heard of it already. There's a gorgeous skirt in this slide that was designed by Gretchen Elsner, who lives and works outside of British Columbia. We found her skirts to be extraordinarily anarchic and playful and material. This skirt is actually made of very fine steel. Other skirts were made of silk and incredibly lush. What we did over the course of 3 years is we embedded computers and various input and output devices into these skirts. The first generation of Whisper actually had a different garment altogether. But in that one, we embedded medical sensors that sensed heart rate and respiration. And we had the breath and pulse of people projected outwards in the space as mathematical visualizations. What you're seeing now were the skirts for the second phase of Whisper, where we embedded vibrators in the lining of the skirt, and we also had muscle contraction bands inside the skirt. So when you put on the skirt, you strapped a muscle sensor around your calf or your thigh, and your muscle movement caused vibrators in another person's lining to react and to become awake. We wanted to get away from the visual and into the more haptic or kinesthetic for this one. The third phase of the Whisper project, we held onto the vibrator as an output, as a receipt mechanism, but we chose the respiration and pulse sensors once more, mainly respiration. So what you basically had when you got into the skirt was the ability to send your breath or muscle activity to somebody else, and they would wear it on their body, in their skirt, in a very private way. Let's see what's next. There's Gretchen Elsner with somebody else wearing the skirts. And let's move to the next screen. We've written a lot about this, and the extraordinarily poetic quality of this project was often, it was often said that because Tekla and I were dancers and because we were women, we liked the very soft and beautiful and almost touchy-feely side of things. But the more I toured with this project to various installations and heard feedback from people, and the more I thought about it, I realized that there was a very dark, potential dark underside to it. I mean, a bit like Bacon being, what was it, a nervous optimist, but an outward pessimist. We had both going on. And I think in most deeply corporeal projects or experiences, you've got both. You've got the grotesque and the beautiful. You've got the pain and the pleasure. Jouissance, of course, this great French notion, is extreme pleasure at the same time as the poignancy of loss and pain. So what I say here is that the abject is much more subtle when we're looking at projects like this. It's become affective and relates to the digital pathways through which the body escapes. That's a direct reference to Deleuze on Bacon, the sense that the mouth is the organ through which the body escapes. Makes me think of Matthew Barney too. Yeah. And what happens to the body once it has undergone these transubstantiations is also abject. This image that we see there with the little drawings, that comes from one of the early experience design workshops that helped us build the whisper garments. I'll show you in a moment a video of one of these workshops. Let's move on to the next one. So I think it'll be helpful to actually see a very grainy video of phase 2 of the Whisper project in Bilbao. These visualizations were visual outputs of the muscular reactions of the people under the skirt. So we didn't forego entirely the visual for this installation. We did subsequently, and it was entirely auditory and tactile. So you'll see people playing with the skirts. This was the Cyber Arts Festival in Bilbao in 2004. We created a small public space where people were invited to put on the skirts. We had to dress them. And there was an option to just put the skirts over your clothes, or really to get the muscle sensors to work better, you had to take off your trousers. And I was so delighted how many people were quite happy to drop their pants for us. It could be that it was warm, and it was Spain, and there was this incredible playfulness to this installation. Other installations of Whisper weren't so playful. Rebecca, I noticed you were going to say something.
Yes, I wanted to ask you that when you are sensing the muscles or like all the, just sensing another person, is it just from one other of the participants, or you're sensing from different people?
This was also a prototype phase. I think during this phase there was one person was transmitting and the group was receiving from that one person. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The next phase of Whisper, that was at SIGGRAPH in 2005, there was the ability for one person to identify the person they wanted to give their breath to. Okay. So that was a more sophisticated platform entirely, by which I could choose you. And I would have to touch, I had an RFID tag on my wrist, and I would touch something in the waistband of your skirt, which would indicate that I was prepared to give you my breath. Mm-hmm. But this muscular one was, it was much more like radio broadcasting. Yeah. But this is the problem when you're devising a project and exhibiting it as you go. I mean, it's not a problem, it's just you're taking an incremental approach to the hardware as well as it, yeah. So let's move on to the next one. Here's another close-up of Gretchen Elsner's beautiful skirts. They were very creepily organic. We had this interest, of course, in the idea of prosthetics and jewelry and that play between the organic and the inorganic that were deeply, deeply fused. We also had very great conversations with Joey Bazalska in Concordia, who helped us work with conductive textiles. You'll see them in a moment. So let's move to the next screen. The idea that the guts of the skirts were actually electronics. The next screen. Here, this is actually a pad that is it's a 3D pad that receives touch and transmits that to the computers. The fabric has metal in it. It's a textile that is shot through with a metallic fiber, so it can translate signal and electricity. It's conductive, and the small pads in the center there are foam that is embedded with metal. I think it's actually sort of carbon powder. You'll see on the next one too. So basically, those were conductive circuits, and when you would put them in a loop, they conveyed a signal. They also conveyed the electricity. When you're dealing with wearables, there's this very real concern with current. So there were certain parts of it that we could replace with fabric because we wouldn't be shocking or electrocuting people. But certain parts that contain more current, we had to stick with wires, unfortunately. And then we'll have a next screen. And then the next one is a little video showing, and this seems so cumbersome now. This is funny how the technology improves in years. This is now what, 3 or 4 years ago. So if we hit that one, you'll actually see, if you start that video. Is that video going to work? Yeah. So by touching his stomach, effectively, he's getting an output reading on the small PDA there. Which is this weird sense of almost like a hole through his body too. It's a strange shot, that one. Let's move to the next screen. So here you've got another Deleuze quote, and I'm wondering if I'm going to also read out a section from my book. Yeah, so with whispers, we send the body out into network space. We funnel the body through one or more of its physiological data sources. This is similar to what Deleuze sees in Francis Bacon's painting, when in The Logic of Sensation, which is the book on Bacon, he describes the mouth as the organ through which the body escapes. The mouth is no longer a particular organ, but it's the hole through which the entire body escapes, and from which flesh descends. We are letting the body escape from itself through one of its organs, digital organs, leaving ourselves with nothing, and this is a quote, nothing but the immense pity that the meat evokes. The whisper wearables don't mimic or simulate affect. These expansions of corporeality operate like a Bacon painting according to a fidelity to materiality. It's nothing like standing in front of Bacon to realize that you're feeling it, you're entirely viscerally engaged with the painting. And I can describe an anecdote from 2 weeks ago when I toured a very crowded exhibition in the Tate with Orla, with my 6-month-old baby, where she started to get very uncomfortable. And babies are extraordinarily kinesthetic creatures. I swear, as we went from one room to the next, and this was the Tate Britain, for those of you who know it, it's not the vast, spacious rooms of Tate Bankside. It's actually an older building with quite contained rooms. I swear all of us were picking up on a palpable kinesthetic tension that came through having so many people in front of so many paintings that I realized we had to leave, and I couldn't find the exit. So I was trying to be very, English and contained and not run from the gallery, but found myself going rapidly into a room that I thought would lead to the exit. And it wasn't. It was a very contained room and had this overwhelming sense of needing to escape or flee. And we eventually did make it safely out of the Bacon exhibit. But I love any powerful kinesthetic experience, because I think it reveals so much, not just about how we exist as individuals, but how we feed off of one another and how we actually respond to art. And so here's a quote from Deleuze: "The body must return to the material structure and dissipate into it, thereby passing through or into these prostheses instruments, which constitute passages and states that are real, physical, and effective, and which are sensations and not imaginings. So getting back to the Whisper project, I'll say that some of the comments we had from people were that for the most part, people enjoyed the garments. They found them luxurious. They found it either playful or intimate. But there were certain people who absolutely did not want to get into these garments because they either feared that we were recording their bodies, their breath, their respiration, and they didn't know what we were going to do with the recordings. We had to assure them that we were never recording them, that we were transposing and transmuting the data immediately in real time into tactile outputs or auditory outputs or visual outputs. There were also people who were afraid that if they were invited to call attention to their breath or their heart, that they would somehow become all too mortal, that it would emphasize the meat. There was somebody who felt that she didn't want to get into these garments because she wanted to have a baby one day and she didn't want to know what they might reveal to her. We were also told by medical practitioners or one in particular, that we were being very irresponsible because awareness of physiological activity and behavior was the domain of the doctor, and it was not something that the person should know about themselves, let alone be able to share with people. So another extreme. We had the opposite response from a woman who, this is all, I talk about these in the book, but a woman who had completed the final stages of sexual reassignment therapy and had the operation taking her from a man to a woman and was now in the hormonal stages. And she asked very much for us to develop a hormonal sensor because she felt that what she most of all wanted to transmit and translate to the people she cared about was her hormonal state. So a project like this that really brings the meat or the flesh and intimacy to the fore evokes extraordinarily strong affective responses. And if we want to just go to the next video, I'm almost finished here. We did workshops. And some of the more powerful workshops with students were ones that had no computers at all and no technology at all. And this is one of the exercises that I was going to do with all of you, possibly with the elastic bands, but possibly just with sensed kinesthetic constructions of ties between people. But what we were playing with here was the idea that there was something living between the skirts. And these students, they're not dance or theatre students, so they didn't have an immediate lack of inhibition to dive in and do these experiments. But what came out of them was quite fascinating. In addition to having the physical experiment, we had them write about their impressions and also draw their impressions. So the drawing that I showed you a few slides back with the ties between the people, that was based on experiments across telepathy and kinesthetic connection and the idea of something organic living in the space between people. Okay, so where do we stand with slides?
You still have the
Few. There's the URL for people who may want it. Oh yeah, let's just go through keep the URL up for a moment. And then I might as well carry on to the end of the slides and then we can open this up more for discussion. Out of these projects came a desire to, in some ways, go even further back to basics. And the initiative that's now happening through where I'm located now, which is at the Smart Lab Digital Media Institute in London, at the University of East London, is a consideration, a very deep consideration of difference, which looks at corporeal and personal difference from the perspective of the many disabled students and adults who benefit from a lot of Smart Lab projects. So Smart Lab has a strong social remit that looks at creative collaborations between technologists and artists and designers, and also sees how these can be applied very specifically in the communities that are in East London, but also much wider abroad. So disenfranchised communities, or communities that are just interested in featuring mixed abilities and how we may use our devices and our bodies differently. So let's go to the next slide. And here we have the incredible kinesthetic quality of text. Philosophy and design are both sensory and conceptual practices, responding to the provocations from the world and producing something that did not exist previously. I love this idea that thought, conceptual thought or imaginings, it is palpable, it's kinesthetic, it's tactile. And the next slide. Encompassing objects, systems, or frameworks for living, moving, touching, and breathing. Design, like theory, is the production of desire. I think that's an oblique quote from Elizabeth Gross, writing on many interesting things. And the last slide. Difference opens us to the elsewhere of matter. And this elsewhere of matter is from the writings of French philosopher Luce Irigaray, when she wrote in the 80s, late 70s and 80s, on sexual difference. And I'm returning to that because sexual difference is not just about the difference between maleness and femaleness. It is a very profound articulation of material difference. And when we look at material in terms of corporeality, as well as the material transformation that a lot of our digital devices and performances and artwork enact, then we're really in a place of, one would hope, elsewhere of matter, or surprising matter is what Lee Edelcourt calls it. She's a writer on design. So these are early steps, and we'll see where these projects go.
Very beautiful. Very beautiful. Do you think that the elsewhere of matter, is that like Henry Bergson's Elan Vital that he would write about?
Yeah.
Yeah, very much.
It really relates to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice. Do you want to open it for questions?
Yeah, Susan, thank you so much for that. It was very engaging. And you brought up so many, I think it's a very rich tapestry of a lot of really complex ideas and histories as well when you start crossing disciplines. I mean, just thinking about Laban and his whole, this idea of what he was grappling with, and a lot of modern dance makers were thinking about in terms of dance and the body, and beginning to explore that outside of just movement, but almost having that kind of the metaphysical as well. And then working with technology, it's very rich, and I'm sure there's probably, hopefully, some people here that want to have any questions or want to comment.
I will say one thing, Stephanie. I enjoyed our conversations, and you mentioned very early on, the first time I spoke with you, that you were quite excited about a relic of Marie Curie's, was it? That's
the
shown
lead
in
box, yes, yeah.
And I think on some level, when I was pulling the various material together for this talk, I had that in the back of my mind.
Oh,
This
interesting.
notion of flesh living over time, which is why I started with the idea of the time being out of phase with oneself, and how we're always, it's as if our materiality is always trying to catch up with ourselves, and we're always trying to address a different corporeal state.
Yeah.
So I thank you for that little nugget that you left
yeah.
me with.
I wanted to, I did want to ask you something. Working with technology, I find as a dance maker is incredibly challenging. And I feel like it brings up a lot of problems, nice problems, but problems nonetheless. You opened up and you spoke about this void between bodies, or I think it's one of the quotes, sorry I wasn't, where it talked about the void between bodies.
For the difference.
Yeah, there's actually, it did say, the void itself is another body, I think is what it said.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that space, and then maybe talk about the difficulties or the problems or the challenges that you've really experienced or been chewing on for the last, you've been working with this for over technology in various forms as it progresses and so forth, but 8 years, I'm going to say, or 10 more, I'm not sure. Does that sound about right in terms of how long you've been really grappling and thinking about working this way?
There's quite a bit of echo.
Oh, is there?
So I more or less understood the question. Well, I think I understood the question, but
speak to her.
what I'm going to say is that Stephanie? Hi.
Yeah, that's me.
If I missed something out, do remind me, sort of prompt me, because I think I got the gist of what you were asking. And I like that you picked up on that quote, because I haven't read Jean-Luc Nancy before now, believe it or not. I'm just reading him now. And that is one of the quotes that's very current that I dropped into this presentation. So it's nice to be able to address it. I'll try and be focused from the perspective of dance. And you're right, it does, working with technologies provokes a lot of problems and frustrations. It makes us re-examine what is really there. And there can be moments of huge crisis of faith, because a lot of what we're reliant on seems to be either scrambled or devalued. And what we're left with is just our bodies in the face of whatever else is out there, which seems like a void initially. So the idea that the void is perhaps digital space is resonant. And one of the things I've come to realize is that, like, even this peculiar interface that we're using here, it might seem like it's cumbersome and limited, but it's incredibly like a body. So there might feel like there's a void between you and me, but what if we were to regard it as being corporeally present with us? So then suddenly we're dealing with the idea that the space between us, digitally mediated space, is flesh. And this is Merleau-Ponty, which for me is a way into a lot of ways of understanding the body and the world. Flesh isn't just my flesh and your flesh. Flesh is this whole material complex that contains the organic and the inorganic and the self and the other. So when you're performing, I find it really helps to see anything that feels like it's empty, where you're like dropped off a cliff and you don't know what to do, to try and understand it as being rich and give yourself the ability to take a breath and then respond.
That's interesting, because I don't know if you're familiar with that. I know you mentioned Butoh, that you've practiced Butoh, and actually in No Theater, Zayami, who wrote a lot about, he codified it basically. There was another term that's actually better than this one, but Ma is, which is actually a very well-known concept. A lot of visual painters adapted it and worked with it a lot from the 20s on, actually. And it's basically this idea of tension in the void, and that the void is necessary. And I think it really ushered on a whole group of artists and theorists to really start thinking about, that as in the substance of this nothingness. It's very poetic, and it's really nice to think about. But it almost requires a kind of ontological shift for the person.
Totally.
The person has to understand that, or have a sense of it, or an appreciation for it. And then it almost needs to be something they can come to of themselves, not something they can be told about. Or I don't know, it's kind of like going to a meditation class for the first time. It takes many sessions before the penny can keep dropping deeper. I don't know, is that...
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love your the sense of tension. Makes me think of tension in the void. Makes me think of the nervous system, and the idea that the nerves and the communication will actually radiate out beyond us, which is why the whole idea of kinesthetic fields is so fascinating, because we sense on so many levels, and voids are never empty.
And one thing that I wanted to bring up is the way in which our society is so fixated with identity. And that I remember Henry Bergson writes about identity being really is in the realm of being rather than becoming. And thus being resides in the past or in the future, because it's either a projection of you in the future or it is really something you have identified with, thus it is static. And because our society and culture and everything that is so focused on being and on having an identity, this further removes us from our body. Because then we must escape and we must move away from that which is in constant movement and in constant becoming and change, and really make ourselves static to then have an identity. So that is where so much of our society is so focused on who are you rather than what moves you or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so true. Levinas has his version of that, which is the saying and the said. And it's the same thing. The said is the word, and it's static. The saying is, because a lot of his work is about language, but the saying is that, your boy is like, what am I going to say next? It's you don't really know. You can't actually force your identity through. I mean, you can attempt, but it's always going to be a bit slippery.
Exactly, because you're reacting in the moment and you're constantly, just about to happen. Yeah. Yeah.
And about subjectivity too, and I don't know how many of you are really working across methodologies and with phenomenology, but it's fascinating being somebody who waves the flag for phenomenology, because phenomenology had such bad press for so many years for being about a unified, coherent subject, and about a process for reinforcing the subject. And that may be so in some phenomenological writing, but late Merleau-Ponty is extraordinary. It's hard to read. It's all over the place. It's all about vibration and the exchange between bodies. It's about intercorporeality. So once we realize that our subject is constantly bouncing off of every other being in our world, then we can't, like the notion of a fixed subject is a fiction.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, and I definitely, all the work that you're doing, what is very important is that it's helping us to have a language of how do we relate in a world that doesn't have to be abstract and removed. Because, we do have that abstract and removed world so down, but it is not the one that it's really relational. So it's very much a way of being able to, as artists, to have not just the language, but have the inhabiting of our bodies that allows us to then have that relationship. So, thank you. It's great.
Yeah,
Love
thank
your
you
work.
so much, Susan.
Any other questions or comments, anybody?
Yeah, I think we're actually...
Anything, Madeline? Come.
Oh, here,
And you can speak, actually, maybe directly onto the camera, because I think that would be that would be the best way.
It'd be nice for me.
Madeline is our first-year grad, and I know she's definitely so interested in phenomenology.
I am, and I'm sorry I was late because I TA earlier, and I wanted to see your whole talk.
Well, Rebecca has the PowerPoint.
Yes,
Okay.
and you are fully
Yeah, and the book.
streamed.
Okay, well, I had a question about, you go about approaching collaborators, what you do and how you evaluate potential people you'd like to work with, because it seems like it would be difficult to find people to really engage with your ideas in a powerful way.
Yeah, that's a tough one. When you work with people in a way that actually really involves the artists trying to understand how hardware and software engineers think, and the engineers really trying to take on board what dancers are talking about, you are in an area where there has to be huge amounts of trust, and there has to be a lot of respect for each other's disciplines and language, but there also needs to be respect for what you're trying to do. So ego can't really play a role in this. What I will say is that I always go by my gut, the sense of who I might want to work with. It may not be the person who seems to have the best CV, but it may be somebody who I feel like I could work with. And I will say, having worked in this area for, well, a very long time now, almost 20 years now, I tend to work with the same people over and over again, because once we build up the bond, there's a lot of trust there. So it's not that new people aren't invited in, but it's that a lot of the old people are invested enough to keep coming back. So I would just say, you need to go out there and talk to people and just start playing on a very small level with experiments, even if they're little, like a tiny robot or a tiny camera experiment, and you'll be able to tell whether there's something that wants to take you to the next stage and the next stage. And you navigate that way, navigate from the gut. I'm not sure if that was your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
I sometimes think that I have kind of like my sensors to whoever loves, like, or is able to feel the force of sensation itself, or to kind of, speak about that somehow at least the vitality is much more important than a lot of the times a lot of different, rational knowledge. So that's...
a good example is how Rebecca and I came to work together. We met in a social occasion in New York through a common friend, and I found out that Rebecca had designed Bill Viola's catalogue, which was a book I just loved. And I knew right then and there, from almost just 5 minutes of casual conversation, that I wanted you to design my book, but the thing is, it hadn't been written yet.
And I know. And it was very funny because the way that it happened is that you sent me at one point when you had written, or when we were starting to figure out, okay, am I going to do it? We needed to start the process. You sent me, I think, an email to which, of course, it took me a while to respond. And then the next time I find myself in New York at Bob's, a friend that introduced us, Bob's home, and I think you called, and basically Ashton just gave me the phone and said, and you said, so are you designing my book? And I'm like, sure. It was one of those completely, that I knew from the moment we had met that I wanted to spend a lot of conversations with you.
Yeah,
so
and it's
very good.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you so much for joining us, Susan, and being willing to work with us through this. I really appreciate it. I hope you're feeling better.
I am, and Orla's feeling a lot better.
Great.
She wouldn't have been able to travel. She was ill. Anyway, thank you for...
It's too much of a long flight.
But this worked out really well.
It did. It was perfect.
It was fun.
It was really wonderful.
Yeah. Great.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you
everyone.
so much. Thank you.
Ciao.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye,
Ciao.
Susan. Thank you.
Bye.